My father has been cheating on my mother for over 20 years, and my mother has also been cheating on my father. Growing up, I believed my family was perfect. Not just good, perfect. My parents, Thomas and Laura, were together for over 40 years, and their relationship seemed rock solid. They were the kind of couple who still held hands on walks, finished each other's sentences, and had inside jokes that would make anyone watching smile. My sister Sarah and I often joked that they were the gold standard of marriage. I'm Michael, 32, and Sarah is 28. The four of us made a habit of gathering for Sunday dinners at my parents' house. It was our little tradition. Mom would cook her signature pot roast, Dad would open a bottle of red wine he'd been saving, and we'd sit around the big oak dining table sharing stories, laughing, and teasing each other. It was the kind of scene you'd expect to see in a Hallmark movie. For years, I saw those dinners as proof that we were an unbreakable unit. I mean, sure, there were small arguments now and then. Sarah teasing me about my non-existent love life. Dad complaining about how no one loaded the dishwasher properly, but nothing out of the ordinary. Nothing that ever made me question the foundation we were built on. Until recently. It started small, like a pebble in your shoe that you can ignore for a while. A few months ago, at one of our dinners, Mom seemed distracted. She wasn't her usual cheerful self, and Dad kept glancing at her like he was trying to figure out what was wrong. When Sarah asked if everything was okay, Mom smiled tightly and said she was just tired from a long week at work. But then it started happening more often. Mom's laugh, which used to light up the room, became less frequent. Dad, usually calm and easygoing, seemed tense, like he was carrying a weight no one could see. Sarah and I exchanged worried looks, but neither of us said anything. After all, everyone has bad weeks, right? We were halfway through dinner when Dad suddenly put down his fork and cleared his throat. "There's something we need to talk about," he said, his voice unusually serious. Mom's eyes widened, and she opened her mouth like she was going to protest, but Dad cut her off. "It's time, Laura." Sarah and I froze, forks halfway to our mouths. "What's going on?" I asked. Dad took a deep breath and looked at Mom. "I think it's best if you tell them." Mom stared at her plate for a long moment before finally looking up at us. "Your father and I are separating," she said quietly. The words hit me like a punch to the stomach. Sarah gasped, dropping her fork with a clatter. "What are you talking about?" she demanded. "You two are. You're like the perfect couple. You don't just separate." Mom looked at Dad, as if silently asking him to take over, but he just shook his head. "They need to hear it from you," he said. Tears welled up in Mom's eyes as she turned back to us. "We've been having problems for years," she admitted. "We've just been hiding it. For your sake. For our sake." I repeated, my voice rising. "You've been lying to us? All this time?" "It wasn't a lie," Mom said quickly. "We really did love each other. We still do. But sometimes, love isn't enough." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My parents, the epitome of a perfect marriage, were splitting up. It felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. Sarah looked just as stunned, her face pale and her eyes brimming with tears. The rest of the evening was a blur. Mom and Dad tried to explain, saying they'd been growing apart for years but didn't want to disrupt our lives. They thought they could work through it, but eventually, they realized it wasn't possible. They insisted the decision was mutual and that they were still committed to being good parents. But all I could think about was the fact that everything I'd believed about our family was a lie. If my parents, who seemed so perfect, couldn't make it work, what hope did the rest of us have? Sarah was furious. "How could you keep this from us?" she yelled. "You act like you're doing us a favor, but all you've done is make us feel like idiots." Mom started crying, and Dad looked like he wanted to crawl under the table. I didn't know what to say, so I didn't say anything. I just sat there, staring at the pot roast that no one was eating. Eventually, Sarah stormed out, slamming the door behind her. I stayed for a while longer, trying to process everything, but the atmosphere was so tense, I couldn't take it. I mumbled something about needing air and left. Over the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. I called Sarah, hoping to talk things through, but she was still too angry. "I can't believe they did this to us," she said. "They made us think everything was fine, and now they're just giving up." I wanted to defend Mom and Dad, to say that relationships are complicated and that maybe they really had tried their best. But I couldn't shake the feeling of betrayal. How could they let us believe in a lie for so long? I started questioning everything. Were all those happy family dinners just a performance? Did they ever really love each other? Or was it all just an act? And if their marriage was a sham, what did that say about the kind of relationships I could expect to have? The worst part was that I couldn't talk to them about it. Mom and Dad both seemed so fragile, like they were barely holding it together. I didn't want to add to their burden, but I also couldn't pretend everything was okay. A few weeks later, I found out something that made everything even more complicated. I was helping Mom clean out some old boxes in the garage when I came across a stack of letters tied together with a ribbon. I hesitated for a moment, then untied the ribbon and started reading. The letters were from someone named David. As I read, my heart sank. They weren't just friendly letters, they were love letters. And from the dates, it was clear they'd been written while my parents were still married. I confronted Mom, and she broke down, admitting she'd had an affair. "It was a mistake," she said through tears. "I ended it years ago, and your father forgave me. But I think that's when everything started to fall apart." I didn't know what to say. The perfect family I'd always idolized was crumbling before my eyes, and I felt powerless to stop it. After the initial shock of my parents' separation, I thought I had reached my limit for how much disbelief and pain I could handle. I was wrong. As if the first announcement hadn't upended my world enough, what came next shattered whatever fragile sense of stability I was clinging to. It happened during one of our regular dinners. Somehow, despite everything, we had managed to maintain the tradition. I think we were all pretending that if we could just keep showing up, things wouldn't feel as broken as they actually were. This particular evening felt tense right from the start, though. Dad was quieter than usual, barely touching his food. Mom was equally withdrawn, her eyes darting between Dad and the rest of us like she was waiting for something to explode. We were halfway through dessert, Sarah's favorite chocolate pie, when Dad suddenly put down his fork with a clatter. The sound made everyone jump. I glanced at Sarah, who gave me a look that said, "What now?" But before either of us could say anything, Dad cleared his throat. "There's something I need to tell you," he began. His voice was unsteady, like he was struggling to push the words out. "Something I should have told you a long time ago." Mom stiffened visibly, her knuckles white as she gripped the edge of the table. Sarah frowned, leaning forward. "What is it now, Dad? Haven't we had enough bombshells for 1 year?" Dad ignored her sarcasm, focusing instead on his plate as if it could somehow make this conversation easier. "I haven't been honest with you," he said finally, "about a lot of things." "What things?" I asked, my stomach tightening. Something about his tone made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. He looked up at us then, his eyes filled with an emotion I couldn't quite place. Guilt, fear, shame. "I've been unfaithful to your mother," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "For more than 20 years. The silence that followed was suffocating. Sarah's mouth fell open, and for a moment, I thought she might laugh, assuming it was some kind of sick joke. But then she slammed her hands on the table, making the dishes rattle. "What the hell are you talking about, Dad?" Mom's face crumpled, and she turned away, tears streaming down her cheeks. She looked like she'd been hit by a truck, even though it was clear she already knew. Meanwhile, my mind was racing. 20 years? That meant his betrayal wasn't some one-time mistake. It was practically my entire life. "I didn't want you to find out like this," Dad said, his voice breaking. "But you deserve to know the truth." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "So all this time, while we thought you were the perfect husband and father, you were cheating on Mom?" My voice was shaking, my hands trembling as I gripped the edge of the table. "It wasn't like that," Dad tried to explain, but Sarah cut him off with a bitter laugh. "Oh, it wasn't? Then please, enlighten us, Dad. How exactly was it?" He hesitated, glancing at Mom, who refused to meet his eyes. Then he dropped the second bombshell. "There's more. I have another family, a woman I've been seeing for years, and 3 children." If the first confession had felt like a punch to the gut, this was a sledgehammer. My head was spinning, and for a moment, I thought I might be sick. Sarah let out a strangled cry, her chair screeching against the floor as she stood up. "You've got to be kidding me," she said, her voice rising. "You mean to tell me you've been playing house with some other woman while pretending to be a family man with us? Who the hell are you?" Dad looked like he wanted to sink into the floor. "I never wanted to hurt any of you," he said weakly. "I try to be there for you, to keep this separate, but it's been eating me alive." "Separate?" I echoed, my voice filled with disbelief. "You've got another family, Dad. Kids who probably think you're their hero, while you've been lying to us for decades. How is that separate?" Sarah was pacing now, her hands flying as she ranted. "Does Mom know about this? Did she know all along and just, go along with it?" At that, Mom finally spoke, her voice trembling but steady. "I found out years ago," she admitted. "He told me everything, and I forgave him. I thought we could move past it, but what, Mom?" Sarah snapped. "You thought pretending would make it go away?" Mom's tears flowed freely now, and I felt a pang of guilt despite my own anger. I couldn't imagine what it must have been like for her, carrying this secret all these years. But that didn't excuse the fact that she'd let us live in ignorance. Dad's confession didn't end there. Over the next agonizing hour, he told us everything, or at least enough to make me wish he hadn't. The woman's name was Diane, and they'd met at some corporate event back when I was a teenager. What started as a fling turned into a full-blown relationship. He even admitted that he'd been spending holidays and vacations with Diane and their kids under the guise of business trips. The more he talked, the angrier I became. Every memory I had of my childhood felt tainted. How many times had he lied to us? How many moments had been stolen because he was off playing the role of father and partner to someone else? Sarah was furious, too, but her anger took a different form. She demanded to know the names and ages of the other kids, what they looked like, what they called him. "Do they know about us?" she asked, her voice dripping with venom. "Or are we just some dirty little secret?" Dad hesitated, and that was answer enough. "Unbelievable," Sarah muttered, shaking her head. By the end of the night, I felt completely drained. Dad's revelations had ripped open wounds I didn't even know existed. Sarah left in a rage, slamming the door behind her. I stayed, partly because I didn't trust myself to drive, and partly because I needed answers. "Why now?" I asked Dad once Sarah was gone. "Why tell us this after all these years?" He sighed heavily, looking older than I'd ever seen him. "Because I'm tired of lying," he said. "And because Diane wants me to be more involved with the kids. I can't keep living a double life." I stared at him, barely able to comprehend what he was saying. "So you're choosing them," I said, my voice hollow. "I'm not choosing anyone," he insisted. "I love you and Sarah. That's never changed." "But you love them more," I said bitterly. He didn't respond, and that silence told me everything I needed to know. That night, I left without saying goodbye. My mind was racing, my heart shattered. The father I thought I knew was gone, replaced by a stranger, and I wasn't sure I could ever forgive him. When Sarah stormed out of the house that night, I wasn't surprised. She'd always been the more impulsive one, the type to react immediately and deal with the fallout later. I, on the other hand, was frozen. My mind was racing, but my body refused to move. I sat at the dining table, staring at the mess left behind: crumbled napkins, half-eaten food, wine glasses with smudged fingerprints. The silence was deafening, broken only by the faint sound of Sarah's car screeching out of the driveway. Mom hadn't said a word since her quiet admission that she'd known about Dad's betrayal for years. She was sitting there like a statue, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her eyes fixed on a spot somewhere beyond the table. She looked small, diminished, like the weight of the past was finally crushing her. "Mom?" I said tentatively, but she didn't respond. She just shook her head slightly as if to say, "Not now." Dad, meanwhile, was pacing the room. He kept running his hands through his hair, a nervous tic I hadn't seen since I was a kid. He stopped abruptly and turned to me, his face a mixture of guilt and desperation. "Michael, I know this is hard to understand," he began, his voice shaky, "but I want you to know that I never stopped loving you or Sarah. This doesn't change that." I stared at him, trying to process the words, but they felt hollow, like someone reciting a bad script. Doesn't change that? I repeated, my voice rising. Are you serious right now? You've been lying to us for decades, Dad. Decades. And you think you can just say you still love us and make it okay? I didn't want it to be like this, he said, his hands gesturing helplessly. I tried to protect you. Protect us? I snapped. By what? Building a whole other life behind our backs. Do you even hear yourself? He sighed heavily, rubbing his temples. It wasn't supposed to get this far. I didn't plan for this to happen. Oh, well, that makes it so much better, I said sarcastically, my anger boiling over. You didn't plan it. That's great, Dad. Thanks for clearing that up. Mom finally stirred, her voice quiet but firm. Stop it, both of you. She looked up, her eyes red and swollen. Yelling won't fix anything. Neither will silence, Mom. I shot back, immediately regretting the harshness in my tone. You've been silent for years, and look where it got us. Her face crumpled again, and I felt a pang of guilt. But I was too angry, too hurt, to stop myself. Why didn't you leave him? I asked, my voice softer now but still insistent. Why would you stay with someone who betrayed you like that? She didn't answer right away. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. Because I thought I could forgive him. Because I didn't want to break up the family. And how did that work out for you? Sarah's voice rang out from the doorway. She had come back, her face flushed and her eyes blazing with fury. You didn't want to break up the family, Mom? Newsflash, it's broken. It's been broken for years. We just didn't know it. Sarah, please, Mom said, her voice cracking. I did what I thought was best. Well, you thought wrong, Sarah shot back, tears streaming down her face now. You should have left him. You should have told us the truth. Instead, you let us believe in this fairy tale while he was off playing house with someone else. Dad stepped forward, his hands raised in a placating gesture. Sarah, I know you're upset, but— Upset? She interrupted, her voice dripping with sarcasm. Gee, Dad, what gave it away? The part where you confessed to cheating on Mom for 20 years? Or the part where you told us you have a secret family? Stop it, Mom said again, louder this time. Just stop. All of you. The room fell silent, and for a moment, the only sound was the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Mom took a deep breath, her shoulders trembling. We can't keep tearing each other apart like this, she said. It won't change what's happened. No, it won't, Sarah said bitterly. But at least we're finally seeing the truth for what it is. I looked at my parents, the people who had been my foundation, my role models, and I felt a deep, aching sadness. They weren't the people I thought they were. And now I had to figure out how to reconcile the image I'd always held with the reality staring me in the face. Dad tried again to explain himself, launching into a long-winded monologue about mistakes and regrets and how he never meant for any of this to happen. But his words felt empty. Every excuse he gave only made me angrier. At one point, Sarah got up and started pacing again, muttering under her breath about how she couldn't believe this was her life. As the hours dragged on, the atmosphere in the room grew heavier. I wanted to leave, to escape the suffocating tension, but I couldn't bring myself to walk out. I felt like I needed answers, closure, something to make sense of the chaos. But the more Dad talked, the less sense it all made. Finally, Sarah couldn't take it anymore. She grabbed her coat and stormed out again, slamming the door behind her so hard that the walls seemed to shake. Mom flinched, her head sinking into her hands. Dad just stood there, looking lost. I stayed a little longer, but eventually, I reached my limit too. I can't do this right now, I said, standing up and grabbing my keys. I need time to process. All of this. Dad tried to stop me, but I brushed past him, ignoring his pleas to stay and talk things through. I couldn't deal with his excuses, not then. As I walked to my car, the cold night air stung my face, but it was a welcome relief from the suffocating heat of the house. I sat in the driver's seat for a long time, staring at the steering wheel, wondering how my life had come to this. When I finally drove away, I didn't have a destination in mind. I just needed to get as far away as possible. But no matter how far I went, I couldn't escape the weight of what had happened. My family was in ruins, and I didn't know if we'd ever be able to put the pieces back together. After that disastrous dinner, I couldn't stop thinking about everything that had been said and what hadn't. The weight of my dad's betrayal was crushing enough, but there was something about my mom's silence that haunted me. It wasn't just the shock or sadness of the moment. It was the way she had sat there, as if resigned to the chaos, like she'd known it was coming all along. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to her story. A week later, I finally worked up the courage to confront her. I showed up at her house unannounced, half hoping she'd be out so I could postpone the conversation. But when she opened the door, looking tired and older than I'd ever seen her, I knew I couldn't back out. "Michael," she said, surprised but not entirely unhappy to see me. "What are you doing here?" "We need to talk," I said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. She hesitated, then nodded. "All right, let's sit down." We ended up in the living room, where she perched on the edge of the couch like she was ready to flee at any moment. I sat across from her, trying to gather my thoughts, but the words came out in a rush. "How long have you known about Dad's affair?" I asked bluntly. She flinched, and for a moment, I thought she might deny it. But then she let out a heavy sigh and looked down at her hands. "Since you were about 15, she admitted quietly. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. 15. That meant she had known for over 15 years, half my life. "Why didn't you leave him?" I asked, my voice cracking. She looked up then, her eyes filled with tears. "Because of you and Sarah," she said simply. "I didn't want to uproot your lives. I thought if I stayed, I could at least give you some semblance of a normal family." I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to yell at her, to demand how she could have stayed with a man who betrayed her so deeply. But another part of me felt an ache of sympathy. She had sacrificed so much for us, and now it was all falling apart anyway. "But you knew he wasn't just cheating," I said after a moment. "You knew about the other family, didn't you?" She nodded slowly, tears spilling down her cheeks. "He told me about them years ago. He said it was a mistake, that it would never happen again. But then it did, and I couldn't leave. I didn't know how." I sat back, trying to process everything. My mother, who I had always seen as strong and unshakable, had been living with this secret for years. And she had done it for us, or so she claimed. "But that's not the whole truth, is it?" I pressed. "You didn't just stay for us. There's more to it, isn't there?" She hesitated, and I could see the internal battle playing out on her face. Finally, she nodded. "You're right," she said quietly. "I stayed because I wasn't ready to leave. But I knew I might have to one day." It wasn't until a few days later that I found out exactly what she meant. I was helping her clean out the attic, a task I had volunteered for mostly to distract myself from everything else, when I came across a locked metal box. It was tucked away behind a pile of old suitcases, covered in dust, and at first, I thought it might just be full of old keepsakes. But when I shook it, I heard the unmistakable rustle of paper. "What's in here?" I asked, holding it up. Mom glanced over from where she was sorting through a box of photo albums. Her expression shifted immediately, a flicker of panic crossing her face before she quickly looked away. "Just some old documents," she said, her voice too casual. "I wasn't buying it. Do you have the key?" "It's not important," she said, her tone dismissive. "Just leave it." But I couldn't. Something about the way she avoided my gaze made my stomach churn. I didn't push her then, but later that night, after she had gone to bed, I went back to the attic with a screwdriver and pried the box open. Inside was a stack of financial records, neatly organized and spanning more than a decade. At first, I didn't understand what I was looking at: bank statements, investment accounts, even a deed to a small condo in her name. But as I flipped through the papers, the truth became clear. Mom had been preparing for a possible breakup for years. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. While she had stayed with Dad for our sake, or so she claimed, she had also been quietly building an escape plan. She hadn't just resigned herself to his betrayal. She had been preparing for the day when she would finally have enough to leave him. I confronted her about it the next morning. "Why didn't you tell us?" I demanded, holding up the papers. She didn't even try to deny it. Instead, She sat down at the kitchen table, looking more exhausted than I'd ever seen her. "Because I didn't want you to worry," she said. "I didn't want you to think the family was falling apart before it actually did. But it was falling apart," I said, my voice rising. "You've been living a lie for years, and you let us live it too." "I know," she said, her voice breaking. "I know I made mistakes, but I didn't know what else to do." For the first time, I saw my mother not as the strong, selfless woman I had always thought her to be, but as someone deeply flawed and human. She had been trapped in a situation she didn't know how to escape, and while I hated the lies she had told us, I couldn't help but feel a sliver of empathy. Still, I couldn't shake the anger. "You should have told us the truth," I said. "We deserve to know." "I thought I was protecting you," she said softly, "but I see now that I only made things worse." In the weeks that followed, the tension between us lingered. I couldn't look at her or Dad without feeling a mix of anger, sadness, and betrayal. The perfect family I had always believed in was gone, replaced by a messy, complicated reality I wasn't sure I could accept. I started going through the financial records in more detail, trying to piece together the full story. I found evidence of secret savings accounts, investments she had made in her own name, and even payments to a lawyer. She had been planning her exit for years, and yet she had stayed. For us. Or maybe for herself. I wasn't sure anymore. One thing was clear. The family I thought I knew was nothing more than an illusion. And now, I was left to figure out what came next. A few weeks after the chaos of my mom's revelations, I got a call from Dad. His voice was hesitant, almost timid, as though he already knew what he was about to say wouldn't go over well. "Michael," he began, "I think it's time you and Sarah meet them." I didn't need him to clarify. I knew exactly who he was talking about. His other family, the woman and kids he'd been hiding from us for decades. The thought made my stomach churn. I didn't know these people, and honestly, I wasn't sure I wanted to. But Dad was insistent. "I know this is hard," he continued, "but they're a part of my life too. This situation has been hard on them, just like it's been hard on you. It's only fair that you meet them, so we can all start healing." I almost laughed at the word healing. How did he expect us to heal from this? But I held back my sarcasm. Instead, I told him I'd think about it. When I brought it up to Sarah later that day, her reaction was exactly what I expected. "No way," she said, crossing her arms. "I'm not doing it. I don't want to meet them. I don't care about them." "Sarah, they didn't ask for this any more than we did," I argued. "They're probably just as confused and angry as we are." She scoffed. "I doubt that. They've had Dad this whole time. We're the ones who've been lied to." I couldn't deny that she had a point, but I also couldn't shake the feeling that meeting them might give me some kind of closure, or at least some clarity. After a long, heated conversation, Sarah made her stance clear. She wasn't going, and she thought I was crazy for even considering it. "I can't stop you," she said finally, "but don't expect me to come along for the ride." So, a week later, I found myself driving to an unfamiliar part of town, my stomach tied in knots. Dad had arranged the meeting at Diane's house, his other partner, the woman who had somehow managed to share him with our family for more than 2 decades. I felt a strange mix of anger, curiosity, and dread as I pulled into the driveway of a modest suburban home. Diane was the one who opened the door. She was around Mom's age, with dark hair streaked with gray and tired eyes that gave away years of stress. "You must be Michael," she said, offering a tentative smile. "Come in." The house was cozy but unremarkable, filled with family photos that seemed to mock me. There were pictures of Dad with Diane, with their kids, smiling and carefree. It was like looking at a parallel universe where my father had been someone else entirely. "Kids, come down," Diane called, and a moment later, 3 teenagers appeared. The oldest was a girl, probably around 17, with curly hair and a guarded expression. She was followed by 2 boys, one about 15 and the other around 12. They all looked nervous, unsure of what to say or do. "This is Emily," Diane said, gesturing to the girl, "and these are Max and Owen." "Hi," Emily said softly, her voice barely audible. The boys just nodded. I tried to smile, but it felt forced. "Hi," I replied awkwardly. Dad was already there, standing off to the side like a nervous host at a party. "Why don't we all sit down?" he suggested, motioning to the living room. The tension in the room was palpable as we sat on opposite couches, a coffee table between us like some kind of invisible barrier. Diane started making small talk, asking me about my job and where I lived, but it felt hollow. I couldn't focus on her words. I was too busy trying to process the fact that these people, these strangers, were part of my family. After a while, Emily spoke up. "We didn't know about you," she said bluntly, her eyes fixed on me. "Not until a few months ago." Her honesty caught me off guard. "You didn't?" She shook her head. "Dad never told us. We thought he was just busy with work or traveling for business. We had no idea he had another family." Her words hit me harder than I expected. For years, I had been angry at them, blaming them for taking my dad away from us. But now, I realized they were just as much in the dark as we had been. Max, the middle boy, spoke next. "Are you mad at us?" he asked, his voice timid. I hesitated, unsure how to answer. "I don't know," I admitted. "This whole situation is a lot." Owen, the youngest, looked close to tears. "We didn't mean to ruin anything," he said. "We didn't even know you existed." "It's not your fault," I said quickly, surprising even myself. "None of this is your fault." The conversation continued in fits and starts, each of us trying to navigate the awkwardness and tension. Diane seemed genuinely kind, but I couldn't help feeling a pang of resentment every time I saw her glance at Dad. She had been part of this deception for so long, and while I didn't know her well enough to judge her, it was hard not to blame her. At one point, Emily asked me about Sarah. "Why didn't she come?" she asked. "She didn't want to," I said honestly. "This has been really hard for her." Emily nodded, her expression somber. "I get it," she said. "It's hard for us too." By the time I left, I felt emotionally drained. The meeting had been civil, almost painfully so, but it left me with more questions than answers. How was I supposed to reconcile the image of my dad as a loving father with the reality of his double life? And what role, if any, did these new siblings have in my life moving forward? When I got home, I called Sarah to tell her about the meeting. She listened quietly as I recounted the awkward introductions, the strained conversation, the revelations about how little they had known about us. "I still don't want to meet them," she said when I finished. "But I'm glad you went." "Why?" I asked, genuinely curious. "Because maybe now you'll understand that this isn't just about us," she said. "It's about them too. And none of you has asked for this." Her words stuck with me. None of us had asked for this, neither me and Sarah, nor Diane and her kids. We were all just collateral damage in the wake of Dad's decisions. For the first time, I started to see the situation not as a battle between two families, but as a shared tragedy. And while I didn't know what the future held, I knew one thing for sure. It was going to take a long time to figure out how to move forward. After meeting Dad's other family, I thought the worst of the storm had passed. I was wrong. If anything, it was just beginning. The fallout from that meeting brought tensions that I hadn't anticipated, especially with Sarah. She had barely spoken to me since the day I told her about the meeting. At first, I thought she just needed time to process everything. But as the days turned into weeks, her silence became deliberate. Texts went unanswered. Phone calls went straight to voicemail. When I finally drove to her apartment unannounced, she refused to open the door. "Sarah, come on," I said, knocking for the 5th time. "We need to talk." "Go away, Michael," she said through the door. Her voice was flat, cold, like she was speaking to a stranger. "I'm not leaving until you tell me what's going on," I insisted. There was a long pause before she finally opened the door, just enough to glare at me through the crack. "What's going on?" she repeated, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "You're asking me that?" "Yes, I am," I said, trying to keep my tone calm. "You've been ignoring me for weeks, Sarah. I don't understand what I did." "What you did?" she snapped, opening the door wider. "You went to meet them, Michael. You went and sat down with those people, like it was no big deal. Like it didn't matter what Dad did to us." "It wasn't like that," I said, but she cut me off. "Don't lie to me," she said, her voice shaking. "You betrayed this family. You chose them over us." Her words hit me like a slap in the face. That's not fair, I said, my own anger rising. I didn't choose anyone, Sarah. I went because I needed answers. Because I needed to understand. Well, I don't need to understand, she said. I don't need to sit in a room with the people who ruined our lives. They didn't ruin our lives, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Dad did. This isn't their fault any more than it's ours. Oh, so now you're defending them, she said, her eyes blazing. Unbelievable. I'm not defending anyone, I said, exasperated. I'm just trying to make sense of this mess. Well, good luck with that, she said, slamming the door in my face. I stood there for a long moment, stunned and hurt. Sarah and I had always been close, united by our shared experiences and our love for each other. But now, it felt like that bond was unraveling, and I didn't know how to stop it. Things weren't any better with Mom. She had always been the glue that held the family together, but now she seemed to be falling apart. She called me almost daily, her voice fraught with worry and desperation. I don't know what to do, Michael, she said during one of our conversations. Sarah won't talk to me. Your father is well, you know how he is. And now it feels like everything is slipping through my fingers. It's not your fault, Mom, I said, though I wasn't sure I believed it. None of this is your fault. She sighed heavily. I should have left him years ago. Maybe then things would have been different. Maybe, I said quietly. But we can't change the past. No, we can't, she said, her voice trembling. But I'm scared, Michael. I'm scared we're going to lose everything. I didn't know how to comfort her. I didn't even know how to comfort myself. The truth was, I was scared too. As for Dad, he seemed to be living in his own bubble, oblivious to the wreckage he had left behind. When I confronted him about Sarah's anger and Mom's breakdown, he just shrugged. They'll come around, he said confidently. They just need time. Time, I repeated, incredulous. Dad, Sarah thinks I've betrayed her. Mom is barely holding it together. And you think time is going to fix this? He sighed, running a hand through his hair. Look, Michael, I know I've made mistakes. I know I've hurt people, but I didn't do this to hurt anyone. I was trying to balance two families, and I thought I could make it work. Well, you didn't, I said bluntly. You broke everything, Dad. You broke us. He looked away, his jaw tightening. I'm sorry you feel that way, he said finally, but I can't change what's happened. All I can do is try to move forward. Move forward? I said, my voice rising. How do you expect us to move forward when everything is in pieces? When Sarah won't even talk to me? That's between you and Sarah, he said. I can't fix that. Of course you can't, I said bitterly, because you're too busy justifying yourself to see the damage you've caused. The conversation ended there, with neither of us saying what we really wanted to say. I left feeling angrier than ever, not just at Dad, but at the entire situation. It felt like no matter what I did, I was caught in a losing battle, with no way to make things right. Sarah continued to distance herself, not just from me, but from everyone. Mom tried to reach out to her, but she was met with the same cold silence I had faced. I started to wonder if we would ever be able to mend the fractures in our family, or if we were doomed to drift apart, each of us carrying our own pain and resentment. The only thing I knew for sure was that the conflict wasn't over. It was deepening, pulling us further and further apart, and I had no idea how to stop it. After weeks of tension and silence, I found myself standing at Diane's door again, this time with a purpose. It wasn't enough for me to meet my father's other family once, and then pretend they didn't exist. Despite everything, I needed to understand them, to see if there was any path forward. Diane opened the door, her expression a mix of surprise and curiosity. Michael, she said, I wasn't expecting you. Is Lily here? I asked. I wanted to talk to her. Diane hesitated for a moment, then nodded. She's in her room. Let me get her. A few minutes later, Lily appeared, her posture stiff, her expression guarded. She was 17, but she carried herself like someone older, someone who had been forced to grow up too quickly. Her curly hair framed her face, and her dark eyes seemed to pierce right through me. What do you want? She asked, crossing her arms. To talk, I said. If that's okay. She studied me for a long moment before finally sighing. Fine. Let's go outside. We ended up sitting on the porch steps, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the lawn. For a while, neither of us spoke. I didn't know how to start, and she didn't seem in a hurry to help me. I know this is weird, I said finally. For both of us. She shrugged. Weird doesn't even begin to cover it. I nodded, unsure how to respond. I wanted to say I'm sorry. For everything. I know none of this is your fault. Her eyes flicked toward me, surprised. You're sorry, she said. What do you have to be sorry for? You're not the one who lied to us. No, but I've been angry, I admitted. At you, at Max and Owen, at Diane. It's not fair, and I know that. But it's hard not to feel. I don't know. Betrayed, I guess. She frowned, picking at the hem of her jeans. You think you feel betrayed? She said quietly. Try finding out that your dad has a whole other family he never told you about. That everything you thought you knew about him is a lie. Her words hit me hard. I had been so wrapped up in my own anger and hurt that I hadn't really considered how this must have felt for them. For Lily and her brothers, Dad wasn't just a part-time figure. He was their whole world. And now that world was crumbling, just like mine. I'm sorry, I said again. Really? I can't imagine how hard this must be for you. She glanced at me, her expression softening just a little. It's hard for all of us, she said. But at least you have Sarah and your mom. We're stuck with, well, this. I wanted to say something comforting, but the truth was, I didn't know how to fix this. All I could do was listen. Over the next few weeks, I made an effort to spend more time with Lily. It wasn't easy. She was guarded, and I couldn't blame her for being skeptical of my intentions. But slowly, we started to find common ground. She told me about school, about her plans to study art in college. I told her about my job, about the places I wanted to travel someday. It wasn't much, but it was a start. One afternoon, as we sat in a park near her house, she asked me something that caught me off guard. Do you hate him? She said, her voice barely above a whisper. Dad? I asked. She nodded, looking down at her hands. I do sometimes, she admitted. But then I think about the good times and it hurts. I took a deep breath, considering my answer. I don't know if I hate him, I said finally. I'm angry and I'm hurt. But I also remember the good times, and that makes it even harder. It's like I'm grieving someone who's still here. She nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Yeah, she said. Exactly. That conversation stayed with me, and it made me realize that if I was going to move forward, I needed to confront Dad directly. Not just for Lily's sake, but for mine. A week later, I arranged to meet him at a diner near his office. He looked nervous when I arrived, like he was bracing for another fight. Thanks for coming, he said as I slid into the booth across from him. I didn't come here to fight, I said, though my voice was tense. I came here because we need to talk. Really talk. He nodded, fiddling with his coffee cup. Okay, I'm listening. For a moment, I didn't know where to start. But then the words came pouring out, a torrent of anger and pain and questions that had been building up inside me for months. How could you do this to us? I demanded. To Mom, to Sarah, to me? How could you lie to us for so long? He looked down at the table, his hands trembling slightly. I don't have a good answer for that, he said quietly. I wish I did. Do you even feel guilty? I asked, my voice breaking. Because it sure doesn't seem like it. He looked up then, his eyes filled with a sadness I hadn't seen before. Of course I feel guilty, he said. Every day. I've made so many mistakes, Michael. I've hurt so many people. And I hate myself for it. His words caught me off guard. For the first time, it felt like he was being honest, like he wasn't trying to justify his actions or shift the blame. He was just admitting his guilt. I never wanted things to end up like this, he continued. But I made choices, selfish, stupid choices, and now I'm paying the price. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to forgive him, to let go of the anger that had been consuming me. But another part of me wasn't ready. Not yet. I appreciate you saying that, I said finally. But it doesn't make everything okay. I know, he said, his voice heavy with regret. And I don't expect it to. But I hope someday you can forgive me. I didn't respond, and the silence that followed was filled with unspoken words. For the first time, though, I felt a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, we could find a way forward.